All right, welcome. Thank you. It's Wednesday, June 24th. I'm Dustin Seaton. I'm an educator in Northwest Arkansas and a parent of two elementary age students in the Fayetteville Public School District. And we are lucky today to have two of our legislators in the state legislature join us today for a teacher town hall. And we hope that this is one of many that we can offer for the future, because I know, like you, there are many questions and comments and concerns about the upcoming fall 2020-2021 school year. So we're blessed today to have one Democrat, one Republican, one senator, one House representative member, but both of them are on their respective chamber education committees. So I'm going to let Miss Representative Denise Garner introduce herself and tell us a little bit about herself as well. So Representative Garner, would you mind doing a quick introduction for yourself?
Absolutely. I'm so glad to be here. And for many of you guys in Northwest Arkansas, from my district and from around my district in District 84, you know that town halls are kind of my modus operandi. So I love to hear from grassroots what's happening in the classroom and to hear your concerns. And so we had planned to do that before COVID-19, and then this is kind of what we ended up with after the virus caused the isolation and distancing. So what we're here for, Senator Sturch and I have been to a couple of conferences together. We worked together on the education committee. And he is a teacher, he is an educator. I am not. I've grown up with education. My grandmothers, my mother, my sisters, my dad were all educators. I'm the black sheep. I'm a nurse, so I'm a health educator. But, you know, I hope that I can help some with my background in public health, and wanted to make sure that we had Senator Sturch on so he could talk about some implications in the classroom and help me with the acronyms, because I'm still learning all of I thought healthcare was bad, education is worse. There's too many acronyms to keep them all in my head. So anyway, we're glad to be here. We will not have the answers to your questions. Most of the time we are hearing about the plans at the same time you are at the governor's press conference. So we are not going to have the answers to your questions, but what we will do is hear your concerns, hear your questions, hear your ideas, and take those back to the committee and to the Department of Education, and especially DESE. So with that, I will turn it over to Senator Sturch and let him tell you a little bit about his background.
Thank you, Representative Garner, and thank you for allowing me to be with you today in Town Hall. I'm here for Arkansas, Parkville, and Randolph. I served 4 years in the House of Representatives from Independence County, and served on the Education Committee then, and now I'm in my second year in the Senate and serving on the Senate Education Committee now. Just like many of you, I fully plan to go back to teaching in the fall at Southside High School, where I teach AP, U.S. Government, and Civics for 11th grade. And so I know that there's several of you out there who are just like me, probably finishing up PD or getting ready for a new round of PD. I just finished my 14th lesson on Science of Reading. And so I look forward to starting another year. I know it's going to be different. I know there's challenges, but I work with great people, and I've got to meet a lot of great people across the state while I've been serving in the legislature, educators I mean, and so I'm very confident in what we can together do to mitigate and navigate through this new world that we find ourselves in. So thanks again for having me today.
All right, so like they said, we probably have a lot of questions and concerns or comments about the 2020-2021 school year. And I know we're not going to fix all the world's problems today, but we are starting the conversations with two of our state policymakers. So thank you all for joining us today. Let's start off with the first questions that we have in the comments. I'll call on you if you have a question or comment. based on the chat, and you can unmute yourself and ask your comment or question to the panelists today. So with that said, the first one is from William Chesser. William, would you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Thank you. William Chester, I'm the science department at the Fayetteville Virtual Academy. My father, when I was a child, used to always say to me, the best way to slow yourself down is to get into a hurry. And I heard that so many times, you know, I feel awkward telling it to my son now. Given the spike in cases that we had following reopening a few weeks ago, my concern is that going back to in-person school might cause the same kind of issue. I think we all want the same thing. What we want is to go back to normal. What we want is to get past this. But my concern is that hurrying might actually cause things to get worse. I was watching the governor yesterday talk about the peak load that's projected at the end of September, early October. My questions are, one, given all this, is it the best idea, and by best, I mean most likely to get us to the point we all want to go to, which is back to normal? Is it the best idea to go back to in-person school in the fall? And then follow up, assuming that we do, which looks like the direction we're going, and Senator Sturch sort of addressed that, isn't it imperative that we have a backup plan in case we see a big spike and we have to sort of come up with a different route? Thank you.
So I don't know who wants to start. Representative Gardner, Senator Sturch, feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll be glad to jump in. I think that is the reason for the blended plan. I think that's the whole point of Arkansas Ready for Learning is to have a blended plan, and DESE is there for support, and each individual district will be making their own plans. So there are a variety of plans out there. Some to come back to school alphabetically certain days, some to come back and separate there. There are several plans out there, but I hear you. Certainly from a public health standpoint, I'm concerned, about the spread. We just don't know enough about how children spread or what happens with their disease. And frankly, I'm concerned about the educators and the staff and everyone who's in the classroom. So that's certainly something that we're talking about, and certainly something that I'm glad to bring up and will bring up and have brought up. I do think that they're trying to be as flexible as possible. And so I do think that there's some of those kinds of things that are being talked about. I think you're right that the governor is pretty adamant that we start school in person, on site, but we have to have those plans ready for something else. And I will say that I do think it's different. It's different planning during the crisis and after we've kind of seen. We do have I do think that we have, we've seen what's happened in other countries and other states. So we do kind of have that information. We just need to use it to make those plans.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Representative Gardner. Did you want to add anything, Senator Sturch?
She did a fine job. I'll just say ditto.
Another question we had in the chat was about the requirement for masks. I know early on there was a question on whether or not districts were going to require, or if the state was going to require districts to require masks for staff and or students. Y'all have any updates or comments regarding to mask usage and wearing in the districts by staff and students come this fall?
I don't think we have any. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the last we heard from the department, was that they were not going to go beyond the ADH regulations or requirements. So right now, the Department of Health has not said anything as far as all students or yet. Right now, that's just being left up to the districts and their individual plans, as Representative Garner talked about earlier. It may come to that point in cases where places that you can't social distance, like such on a school bus, yeah, students may be required to wear masks then, but as far as today, there is no requirement yet from ADH or ADE to require masks yet.
The plans I've seen have strongly recommended masks. You know, I happen to be in Washington County where we've certainly had a big spike, where the mayor actually has mandated mask in public use. What the governor has said is that he prefers that not to happen. He prefers to for all of us to be kind of standardized. Although with the plans in education, he's given that that ability for the districts to make some of those plans. But the plans I've seen have said strongly recommend, and if there's a case, then that may change. But you know, the governor understands, I think, that masks are important and that's a great way to mitigate the spread. He also doesn't want to be a police state, and it's tough to enforce. And so, you know, I think he's on board with the mask. Certainly in our private conversations, he said that he wears a mask. He's showing the world that he believes in wearing masks. But I think he'll allow the districts to make that determination, and it'll be strongly recommended until an outbreak or something, or the first case, not an outbreak necessarily, but the first case or something like that. We certainly will ask. That's on the list of questions to ask for sure.
Good deal. And we have had several additions, so I'll just remind everybody to mute themselves, but ask your questions in the chat. We'd love to do this in an orderly fashion. I'm going to call on Suki Hires. She had a question in the chat that kind of relates to local control, and if you don't mind unmuting and asking your question.
Hi. Yeah, my question really has to do with the situation of local control. One of the things that we noticed when this all started back in March, districts were not given the ability to make the decision for themselves to go to AMI work. We had to wait for the governor to let us. We're seeing situations with masks where, you know, we can't have a statute locally that kind of interferes with a state statute or goes beyond it. So I'm concerned as to whether or not districts are going to have the power to make decisions about when to close school, how to run things, and whether or not they can require safety precautions like masks. So that's just something that's on my mind.
Right.
I think you'll probably see that there's going to be a whole lot more discussion on flexibility and feasibility. Some of the requirements that we're hearing, or not requirements, but suggestions that we're hearing, I should say, you know, are not very feasible in certain parts of school day or certain parts of the school outcome. I can just say up in my area, for example, Fulton County, Salem schools, Viola schools, they look a whole lot different than Fayetteville or Rogers or Springdale. And so I think you'll find the answer is going to probably be, it's going to be left up to the local districts, because like I said, certain cases will be minimum in my area, whereas in Northwest, they may be still a hot spot. And so I think you'll have to have some flexibility with school districts in that regard.
Yeah, I think from just listening to a lot of our administrators, they're really just worried about what does day one look like? How do we prepare for day one in terms of busing and social distancing in the classroom? I know that y'all both said that you're going to be speaking with the DESE officials the first week of July. And that's one question that we all are asking from the education side, is just what does day one look like on site come August 13th? And I know each district has their own plans. Do you have any recommendations or comments that you would like to share about what day one potentially could look like?
I think Representative Garner mentioned this already, but I want to mention it again. The Ready for Learning website has a lot of great resources so far that both the department and DESE have put out. They're actually encouraging all school districts to go ahead and have Ready for Learning committees set up so that they can get input from their local folks about what they think is feasible, about what they think is possible. And so I would encourage everybody to go to that website. You can just Google it, Arkansas Ready for Learning. But it'll have a link there, and you can see all the different memos and information that the department's put out so far, both for administrators and teachers as well. I found it a lot of great information, even preparing for this call today. So I would definitely encourage them to be, one, looking at that website, but two, getting involved. If your school has already formed a committee, find out it, get your input made, and if they haven't, make sure that you can either get a spot on it or at least know when they meet so you can have your ideas discussed.
Yeah, that's great advice. I know a lot of the websites have the members listed for each district's Ready for Learning committee. So that is a good point to contact them locally. We also have a question from Steve Boss. Would you unmute and ask your question to the panelists?
Yes, thank you both for having us here today and for having this town hall so we can discuss this. It relates again to the UAMS model that they showed yesterday at the governor's press conference. And they showed a peak of active infections in late September of about 180,000 cases in the state. Having some deep knowledge of these models to get that high of an individual case count on an individual day requires that you infect a total of about 3 million people, which is the entire state of Arkansas. Is that advice that UMS is really giving to the governor, that they expect the entire state to be infected? And if that's the case, why are we even thinking about going back to school?
Right. I can tell you that no, that's not what they're saying. They're talking about the median. The models, and I don't have the perimeters, but I certainly will get those for you. But I can tell you that the model is, the peak of the model is if we don't do anything, if everybody goes about their business, if everybody does whatever they're doing, and there's no social distancing, and there's no mask or anything like that. Obviously, we want to mitigate even the median. And so that's what the governor is trying to do now. We want to prepare for that worst, but certainly don't expect that. Not with what we're doing and how we're preparing right now. But it is a concern, and it is something that we need to pay attention to. And I think we did a pretty good job in the beginning slowing down the curve, but we're going to have to continue doing that. I know it's tough. Everybody gets tired of staying in and not seeing other people, and masks are hot, and I get all of that, but we've got to do it in order to go back.
Okay, let's go to Tracy Slatery. Would you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Well, it's just asking about school districts and having the power to decide what works best for those districts. Districts all over the state of Arkansas look different and have different needs and different concerns, and there probably will be different numbers and outbreaks. And I'm looking at mass, thinking about dress codes and how we, require students to wear, we have rules and they have to follow them, and students are sent home for not wearing appropriate dress. So I'm wondering why masks are that much different. I know they would be difficult for younger students to maintain, but everyone is saying they're strongly recommended. All the scientists are saying that, and I feel like that's a small thing to ask of our community to help keep our community safe. And so I don't think I'm just very concerned about some of these things that the scientists are saying we need to do, and I'm concerned that we're just going to say, well, we recommend them, but we're not going to require them.
That's certainly certainly something we can bring up, and it does seem to me logical that it would be part of the dress code, or it could be part of the dress code, at least in certain settings where peaks are high, or or whatever. So that's certainly something we'll talk about.
In the comments that we had for preparation for today's town hall, we had some teachers ask, will it fall on the teachers' expectations to teach students how to properly wear masks or to enforce proper mask usage? And that was a question that teachers had, and I didn't know if that was something that y'all could share back with the DESE officials on. Is there a plan for any of the districts that do require masks, if there's a plan for how teachers can best not only have the masks, but teach students and even staff members how to properly wear those PPE materials?
I do think that we're depending a lot on the School Nurses Association, and they will take on a lot of those responsibilities. But there are a lot of places in Arkansas that don't have school nurses. So, you know, there'll be a lot of that kind of thing. Procurement, we'll have to deal with procurement for PPE, and we'll have to deal with education about how to wear a mask. And I can tell you from just wandering around, there are a lot of people that don't know how to wear a mask. And it is, you know, it is not effective if you don't wear it correctly. So that's something, you know, one of my biggest issues on the education committee, and it's something that I've kind of promised myself from the very beginning, is that, you know, I would really watch myself trying to vote on any mandate that we don't give support to the teachers. We cannot expect the teachers to take on the nurse's role and the technologist role and try to educate the students and the, you know, all those wraparound services that need to happen. So you've got advocates in both of us that are going to be trying to make sure that we have those supports, certainly before we ask the teachers to do those sorts of things.
The next question, Anna Ballou, would you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Sure. My question is, how do we ensure that educator input is an integral part of the planning for reentry, the implementation of the Arkansas Ready to Learn model, and the evaluation of the efficacy of our instructional delivery? Particularly, I'm concerned about the latest waivers offered by the State Board of Education. The applications are due this Friday, and they're set to be approved on the 29th. Maybe that's Monday. And those waivers in particular waive the rights of the PPC, which is the elected body that is the voice of educators. And when I use the term educator, I mean anybody who works in the school. So that's the big label underneath. It includes both certified and classified.
Yeah, great question.
James, you want to tackle that one? Or
Well, I'll do the first part at least. Going back to what we've already mentioned about the how do you have input, how do you make sure teachers have input, is that Ready for Learning. So as I talked about the website, the department has been, like I said, very anxious for schools to go ahead and get those committees formed with teachers. And so if you don't know about your committee yet at your school, be sure and ask one of your administrators if that committee has been formed or when will it be formed, so that either you can be on that committee or at least you can have someone that you know of on that committee to share your input with. And I'm sure it's just like any other committee. They're always welcome to input. They're always welcome for people to go. But those Ready for Learning committees will probably be the ones that are having to deal with on a local level same issues that we've been talking about.
and I can say definitively that the intent of those waivers is to make things as flexible as they can be in a time of crisis. But I do understand that we've got to make sure that those waivers don't open the door to something more, or make sure that everyone is doing their part, and that we're not forcing, forcing mandates or extra jobs or whatever on the educators, because that you've got enough on your plate. So we've got to make sure that the educators are taken care of.
I will tag on a minute. We hear a lot about the way for duty-free lunch or your personal planning periods and things like that. Changes being made to that. As far as I'm I know as far as I'm concerned, as long as schools are having a regular scheduled day, those duty-free lunches and those personal planning periods do not go away. You'll see what happens is there'll be one set of standard for regular school in session. There'll be another set of standards for virtual. So, I mean, it makes sense, I guess, if you're doing virtual, it necessarily doesn't have to have a 30 lunch period or planning period and things like that. So virtual school or virtual plans may look different than regular school plans, but it necessarily is not that they're taking it away for everybody.
And oh yeah, Anna, go ahead. Do you have a follow-up?
Ask a follow-up on that, because when I look at the summary of the waiver process that was released by DESE, you're right that some of those waivers are intended for off-site instruction, so days when technology is our primary delivery. But there is a caveat, and it says, or if necessary to implement ADH requirements or guidelines. And so that to me opens it up to be applied on-site if ADH guidelines require it. And to Representative Garner's point, that the intent of these waivers is good, I would agree with her because I watched the video of the presentation by Ms. Salas Ford. However, if intent is not in written form, it's irrelevant, unfortunately, because that's what I've learned being a part of Personnel Policy Committee and in looking at policies and any type of recourse, is that if it is not in black and white, there is no way to reverse it. And so that's really another layer of the concerns about the waivers, because I think sometimes it's presumed that educators are going to automatically be in opposition to the direction that a district wants to take. And I think that's a dangerous presumption, because educators are the ones who are going to be executing this plan, whatever it happens to be. We have a vested interest in making sure that whatever the plan is the very best one for everyone involved. So for creating an environment that is conducive to learning, for creating an environment that is safe for students to learn and for teachers to teach. So again, that's one of my biggest concerns as we transition.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Let's go to Debbie Alsip. Would you mind unmuting and asking your questions about class sizes?
Yeah, some of the districts have released their plans, and I haven't seen any that have specifically said they're going to reduce class sizes. And if we're not requiring masks because we believe we can social distance, how is that going to happen in a classroom of 30 students?
Yeah, I don't know that. That's a question that we are going to have to ask, and that's something that the committees are going to have to deal with. I can't imagine that they don't have plans to meet in bigger classrooms or cafeterias or something for social distancing, but that's something that we'll have to look at for each plan.
Mm-hmm. I know that's a concern of a lot of teachers right now. What does socially distance look like in the classroom with 25 or 30 kids? So that is definitely a consistent theme. Becca Braun.
When you're already using all the classrooms you have.
Right, exactly.
Becca Braun, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
So my question was, in the case of the outbreak, my understanding is that there will be some type of brief closure for the school to do a deep cleaning, but obviously whatever classroom that outbreak takes place in, that's where it would have been most likely to have spread. So in the event that there is an outbreak, will they do some type of where the students within that classroom either have to stay home for a longer period of time or some type of like testing for those students who are in the same classroom or riding next to them on the bus? And what does contact tracing and quarantining look like in the classroom, basically?
Did y'all want to answer that question or comment?
Well, I think she was mentioning maybe a preliminary plan or an idea where if there was an outbreak in a school, particularly a classroom, what would be procedures for either closing the school down and then deep cleaning and how long that might be. Some have, suggested, well, you should just go ahead and do the 14 days, 2 weeks off and then come back. We don't know that yet as far as, whether it's going to be a directive as far as, if this, here's the plan that everybody must follow, or if it's going to be left up to school districts as far as how long you stay out and the deep cleaning that goes on and so forth. But I do understand the question. I wrote it down as far as the contact tracing and so forth. So I'll get a better clarity.
Thank you.
Okay, and I would say that Sarah Thompson has shared the Ready for Learning website in the chat. For those that are interested in looking at the plan from DESE, I also included the school-related health questions that you can use. It's a hotline for ADE or ADH, hotline that's open for during hours and after hours. I called this week just to ask questions about the requirement for masks, and there was somebody very quickly that answered the phone and addressed my questions. So let's move to the next question then. How about Rebecca Gilmer? Would you mind unmuting and asking the panelists your question?
She had to leave. She stated it in the conversation, but I think she wanted her question to be asked still.
Okay. She asked specifically, how are vulnerable populations being addressed with the plan for reopening?
And she looked like she was talking about administrators, teachers, and staff.
Right, and that's both of those things, whether we're talking about educators or we're talking about the students, both of those things will be on an individual basis. So basically, ADE has said that those local committees will be discussing those and making sure that we have ways to deal with any of the teachers who have immunosuppression or older, whatever, and students. So we've got to have plans for both of those things that the committees will determine. So all of those things have to be looked at in the Ready to Learn committees in each district. And again, each district's going to be different. In some districts, there will be ways to determine who's doing virtual and who's doing in classroom. Some will do both, or some may have to be in a smaller classroom. But those issues have to be looked at. That's part of the requirement for the plans.
Right. I think ADE has already had some conversations with us and with school districts about those who might be vulnerable populations, whether they would be doing a hybrid class or strictly online, virtually, whether it be that they, come into school and record, but they don't have a classroom, or whether they can do it from home, provided that they have the right equipment and things like that. So we're working on as far as, what can we do with personnel who might be considered vulnerable, as well as what Representative.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another question is coming up about students with disabilities. Tanya Essex, would you like to unmute and ask your question to the panelists?
Yes, I work with students that are deaf and hard of hearing, and they require the ability to speech read and see teachers' faces in order to understand what's being said. And so I was wondering if there's going to be flexibility with using masks versus clear face shields. Will there be funding for those types of things? And also, my other question is providing access to those students when we're doing distance learning. Zoom seems to be a popular platform to use right now, but it doesn't provide closed captioning. And so I feel like we're not meeting those students' needs with the current direction we're going.
Do you know of a platform that would provide the closed captioning as far as anything that would compare to Zoom for virtual?
Google Meets does have closed captioning available. The only way you can do captioning on Zoom is if you actually have someone typing during the Zoom meeting. But to expect someone to type that fast is not a reasonable solution.
Right.
Because I've tried it many times and it's very hard to keep up with a Zoom class instruction for captioning. So, you know, at this point in time, last year, my students struggled with online platforms because there was no captioning. They had a very hard time understanding what was going on.
Right. To answer a couple of the questions, I guess, one, will there be flexibility? Yes, there should be, as far as the face shields, you know, versus a face mask. Did they have funding? Yes, they should have received already their funding from the feds. So school funding for Arkansas, as far as the state share, is going to be fully funded this year, no cuts. Regardless of whether it's virtual or in person. And then on top of that, if you remember the last stimulus bill that they actually passed, it actually had funding for school districts, and they should have already received that. That was supposed to be used for technology needs, software needs, to kind of transition easier to a virtual type environment. So those two questions I can answer. The third one I'll need to look on as far as other platforms. I know at Southside, we've already went through, I think, 6 hours of PD, and then I've got 3 more on Friday to do Google. So Google Meets, Google Classroom, things like that. And so several school districts may already be having teachers go through some professional development to kind of get used to that change in instruction.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I'll add a comment. I'll read a comment. Lori West, speaking of vulnerable populations, said that we must not only place the safety of our students as a priority, but also consider our staff members, our cafeteria workers, our school nurses, administrators, etc., by wearing masks successfully, which is a point well taken. And then Heather Doyle also is concerned about large class sizes and social distancing being an impossibility. And then Shelly, I don't know if you're still on, if you'd want to unmute and ask your question. You might have lost her. Her comment was, Dr. Smith stated yesterday that they have seen an explosion in cases where people are not able to social distance and not wear masks. It is impossible to social distance at school, and several people are in close contact all day long, even if they stay in one classroom all day. If we're going to start school back on site, requiring a mask is a small thing to ask. For protecting students and teachers. And then William Chester, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
The answer is yes, but I've been typing lots of different things, so I apologize. My question, my latest question that I'm sort of thinking about is, it's on in the discussion earlier about the Ready for Learning committees. It sounds a lot like, and please correct me if I'm misinterpreting our representation. Please let me know if I'm misinterpreting this. It sounds like fairly extraordinary powers are being granted to districts through the form of these Ready for Learning committees. So for example, waivers and things like that, it sounds like that power is being designated to the Ready for Learning committee. I'm not going to hold you to any comments you made today. Don't worry, I get it. My question is this: how much power is that if the Fayetteville district, for example, decided to go virtual only for the first 9 weeks of school through their Ready for Learning committee, and I mean the whole school, K through 12, could they choose to do that? Or is there a stop, a ceiling from, I guess, DESE or from somewhere that says, no, you cannot do that? And if not, where is that line? Sorry, that was a complex question. My apologies.
Well, my assumption is that it rests with the governor. I mean, the governor, along with DESE, has said they feel we need to be starting school in the fall. Now, I personally don't think that the committees, even the school board and the superintendents, could just do that on their own. But there certainly all willing to talk about those kinds of issues. If there's a, since we're in the spike, does what we do look different? Or if Sevier County has a spike, what does that look like differently? Or those kinds of things. I think they're all willing to listen, and I think they're all willing to work together. But, and James has been around longer than I have. Certainly the senator may have some different ideas, but my gut feeling is that we need to be doing the best we can do to make sure that we're doing what the governor and the Department of Ed are asking us to do.
I was just going to add, I'm not sure that power would be the right word to say.
Yeah.
This committees. It's more like an intercessor. So they're trying to give the districts the ability to make plans, to vet ideas, and then those committees, of course, then will submit their ideas and plans on to DESE and ultimately the state board. And so if there is, a need for a waiver, or if there is a need for some changes to be made to what the school year looks like, or to how instruction is delivered, I think those are committees are where it starts. I'm not sure that they have the ultimate say, but I will say that's where the discussion starts, and therefore those ideas can be then given on and submitted to those who have the authority to make those decisions.
Oh, yeah, and sorry, I'm going to jump back in real quickly. I guess power was probably an ill-advised term. I apologize. I recognize where ultimate authority lies. I guess, let me give you a for example, okay? Right now, Bentonville, I believe, has said something along the following lines. Hey, our Ready for Learning committee has decided, you, the parent, you choose virtual or in person. You make that choice. Here's my question. What if 98% or 100% of parents in Bentonville choose virtual? What happens? Thanks.
I mean, as far as what happens with instruction, or what the school would have to do to make those accommodations?
No, I mean, are they allowed to do that? I mean, if the governor is saying we want in-person school in the fall, but everybody in a town chooses virtual under that situation, what happens?
I think if in that instance, if it was such an overwhelming majority, they would then ultimately have to submit their plans to do a virtual instruction time or in whatever to the board. And so then, of course, given the circumstances or what's happening at the time in Northwest, the board would ultimately either approve or deny certain aspects of it or whatever. But I know in Batesville, Batesville School District, they're doing the same thing as far as already anticipating giving the option of a virtual schooling. And now whether that's got as much popularity as it does up there in Northwest, I don't know, but at least they're giving that option to where they have some idea of how to do staffing, how to go about software and needs for children, and making sure they have that type of stuff. So all that I know has already been submitted to DESE, and so I think that's where they're starting.
The reason I ask really is this. I did 3 years at the Don Tyson School of Innovation when they first opened, and I've now done 3 years with the high school portion of Fayetteville Virtual out of my 10 years as an educator. So I've actually spent more time in a kind of not traditional brick and mortar than, well, as a virtual teacher, I know it's a very different beast. I mean, I felt for those teachers trying in the middle of the stream to switch over. It's very difficult. So I circle all the way back to my very first question, which is my major concern is this. If we find out, and I hope to God we don't, but if we find out after a month, oh man, this ain't working, to me, it's of critical import if we want to salvage as much of this school year as we can to have like okay, this is what we do in that case. And my suggestion has been, look, we got a bunch of virtual teachers in Fayetteville. What I would say for Fayetteville is take these virtual teachers who've been doing it for several years, and we have all the way from 4th through 12th, make us TOSAs. And our whole job now is trying to get the rest of these teachers through. Now, that's just me spitballing, but that's what I just keep getting back to. I have a 10-year-old. He was not challenged enough by, what I get that we were trying to put together an emergency situation, but we have no excuse to get caught with our pants down again. That's all I'm saying. I'm going to shut up now.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chesser. I see a lot of comments and questions in the chat, so I want to make sure we get as much of that as we can. Beth Horton, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, everyone. I was just wondering if there's going to be any requirement as far as health requirements go when staff and students obviously are starting back to in-person learning. Is there going to be some sort of a requirement for them to have a negative COVID test within X number of days of starting back? Because obviously, if we come and the first day a child gets ill, they have a fever, they go home and it's found out that they do have COVID, then just a few days of beginning back to the school year, then we could theoretically have to shut everything down. Everybody have to go into 2 weeks of quarantine. So I was just wondering about the testing.
Well, the big issue with testing is that it doesn't help to test with a PCR test if you're negative. You could have the test one day and then actually be positive the next. So, I mean, it's really tough to do preventive testing unless you can do it on a consistent basis. And we don't have the test to do that. So right now we're testing with symptoms or with known exposure. And I wish I could tell you that we had enough tests to do everybody who's going back to work and then keep testing, but it doesn't at this point make sense to do PCR testing, the testing to determine whether you have COVID or not before you go back. If you were going to be necessarily with someone who was particularly vulnerable, like if you were getting ready to have to take care of your grandmother, then it would help to be tested and then you would quarantine. But if you're going to test and get a negative test and then go into the classroom or anywhere really, your likelihood of being symptomatic at the time of your or the time of the test, you could either be pre-symptomatic or you could be negative, and the test is not going to show up yet. So it's really difficult to do that right now. We just don't have the testing facilities still to do that. Does that make sense? And we don't have antibody tests. We don't know enough about the disease to have a good antibody test yet. We are working on that. UAMS is working on that, actually. Once we know whether you develop antibodies from the disease or whether you continue to have antibodies for the disease, that's when we'll know a little bit better about whether or not to go ahead and test for antibodies. But right now we don't have an accurate enough test, and we don't know enough about COVID to know whether we're developing antibodies and how long they last. So that's what makes it difficult for antibody tests and for vaccine tests or for vaccine development. And we don't have enough for the PCR test at this point in time. And you'd have to do it weekly, and even then, even if you did it weekly, you'd have a shot at being sick the day after. So I don't see that happening. I just don't think we have the capability to do that, and I don't think it's helpful.
And there are several great comments from Judy Dunmeyer. We can add those. I'll save the chat and make sure we share it with our legislative panelists. Nicole Norris, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. Coming from a very small school district, and we're very rural, I'm always thinking about those families who do not have internet access. And I know for a lot of our kids, AMI was very difficult for them, and that did not necessarily include all the technology of blended learning or virtual learning. So what's going to happen with those kids that don't have internet access?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And it certainly is an issue, and it certainly is one that we're all looking at. I do think that we'll have some legislation eventually to look at that, but we're also pulling in a variety of private sector and getting some help to make sure that we have broadband access, not just for the students, but for the teachers too. There's some educators that have to come to the school to have broadband access. So that certainly is an issue. It's one that the technology folks at DESE are looking at, and it's something that the legislature as a whole is looking at, and it's something that we know is an issue. And you should have gotten a survey from the department. Each school system should have gotten a survey just for technical aspects of the district and technical needs and technical gaps. And those surveys will be looked at, and that's what we'll try to use to make sure that those gaps are filled before school.
Yeah, if one thing the current crisis we find ourselves in has taught us that it was the need for broadband to go ahead and be now, not later. We had several discussions this past session about different grant programs or different public-private partnerships that we could do. We've already then funded 2 broadband expansion grants this year and applied for federal funds as well. So, of course, it doesn't happen overnight. Infrastructure can't be built overnight, but at least it's told us the importance was yesterday. So we need to get our act together today.
Thank you very much.
I think you'll see that's a bipartisan effort. I think everybody realizes that it's an issue and we need to fix it.
And there are several questions about the possibility of school not starting in August. Like, is there a tipping point or anything that you know of DESE and the governor or the Department of Health is looking at in terms of what they're using as a guideline or a baseline for making that determination? And is there even a possibility of maybe starting school later, like 2 or 3 weeks later, maybe around Labor Day, to allow teachers when they get back on contract to come back to school and do some of these virtual and on-site best practices and trainings for students?
I actually had an opportunity to talk to the governor. So 3 or 4 of us were in the room talking about some of the issues that we felt like our constituency were dealing with. And one of the things that I specifically asked him, if we might at least have the students come back a little bit later to give educators and staff a little more time to deal with some of these things, like learning some of the virtual, some of the technology, or figuring out classrooms, all those kinds of things that the teachers, especially the folks that don't come back until a week before school starts, could deal with some of those things. And he said all options are on the table. So, I mean, I think he is willing to talk about any of those kinds of things, but he knows that for a lot of different reasons, he wants to make sure that we're starting in the classroom if that's at all possible. Senator Sturch, have you heard something different in the Senate?
No, what I was just going to add to it was, like I mentioned earlier, we've already started some PD on Google Classroom and virtual learning and so forth. I know most contracts don't start till after July 1 anyway, but there might be some flexibility for districts to go ahead and start either in late July or early August, to where your contracted PD days might be all done on the front end rather than half on the front or half on the back, or in the middle of the school year, that some of those days might be moved in a little on the front side to help with that. Another discussion that we're having or trying to have is figuring out, there's still some concern about the loss of learning from last school year. So there are some talks about, whether we should have some type of intervention or remediation for students 2 weeks before school starts this year. We don't know what that will look like. The assessments next year may show us, 2 different things. It may show us how big this gap was from the loss of learning this year, or it may show us too how good or bad virtual learning is overall. So, there's a couple of ideas floating around about what to do for the beginning of this school year to help students, as well as whether we should go ahead and have assessments for next year, just so that we have some idea of what we're looking at.
One of the other things that has just been mentioned to me is that there are a lot of mandated PD that you do every year that maybe could be postponed, except for new teachers, for another year, or the switching out some of the PD hours for the things that we really need to be doing, as opposed to some of those mandated.
Right.
So that may be something, and that may be something that you guys could help with to say, what is it that you see every year that might be every other year, or next, postponed until the end of the year, or getting all those hours at the front end, or whatever. So
the rotation may change. Most school districts, of course, the state only requires 36 now, but most school districts have contracted for 60 PD. There's always that flexibility that, we can try to make work somehow, some way.
And we probably have time for maybe one or two questions. I see one in the chat that's probably on every teacher's mind. We've heard Georgia has sought a waiver to cancel all state assessments for the 2020-2021 school year. Is there any possibility that the legislature or the governor could seek a similar waiver for Arkansas, as to waive out of our standardized assessments for this school year?
Well, like I said earlier, it may be a little early to tell. Georgia's assessments are a little bit different than ours. I think they're kind of throughout the year, throughout the school year, and their accountability, of course, is a little different than ours. What we might do, instead of waiving the assessment, is maybe waive some of the accountability that it's tied to. So I've already mentioned, some of the benefits of going ahead and having the assessment might be to see where the gap exists from last school year to what we need to do to try to make sure students are on track for this school year. It might also be then a way that we can try to track virtual learning. So, but it may be something that instead of waiving, might waive the accountability standards with it. So like A to F schools, we might waive, being able to, go ahead and release those types of things. We might be able to just do the assessment without having necessarily accountability kick in at the same time. So as far as I know, the department hasn't, said anything about waiving it for this next school year as they did last year. Certainly the governor and the department could ask. That's usually a federal thing, not a state thing. We'd have to ask from the feds under our plan right now, so that's all I know for that right now.
Okay, and it looks like we have a few questions, but the last one, we'll let Michelle Wolchok, if you don't mind unmuting and asking your question, and then we'll give both of our panelists the last chance for last comments.
Yes, thank you. I just was wondering, I know that the state of Arkansas received a large amount of money under the CARES Act, and I was just wondering how, I can't remember how much, and then how is that being dispersed to different districts, and what guidelines might be put upon how districts can spend that money? Just a little bit more information from that, please.
As I mentioned earlier, it should already have been distributed to each district. So I know, I think Batesville School District, theirs here in my hometown. So school district should be able to tell you how much it was. I'm sure it's available somewhere online. I'm not sure where, to tell you the truth right now, but they did receive part of the CARES Act funding for each school district, as well as each college and university. There were some guidelines. It changes because of the federal department guidelines. So they, I think one of the main emphasis was, like I mentioned, the technology, transferring to maybe a virtual learning environment, how to go about as far as making sure students had Chromebooks, or making sure they had, the right software that they could do it in the schools and that kind of thing. So there were some guidelines on it, but I can't tell you offhand what they all were.
So that money may have already been spent by districts as well to get us through the end of last school year.
Well, I don't know if they got that early. It's just been within the last month or so. And so I think it will be more for the next school year versus.
And I would like to point out, thank you, Michelle. There are still questions about just making sure when y'all do meet with officials from DESE that there is a big concern about students with special needs, what types of flexibility will be available. Also, just students with lack of access to Wi-Fi and just having a lack of the on-site instruction or providing instruction from school instead of from home. So anyway, with that being said, I'm going to open it back up to Representative Gardner and Senator Sturch. Is there any last minute comments you would like to share with us before we conclude today's first town hall?
Senator Sturch, I began early. Will you go ahead this time?
Well, I want to say thank you for joining both of us today. One thing I've always admired about Representative Garner was her willingness to listen. We don't always agree on every issue, of course, but I did always admire her willingness to listen. I think you've kind of seen that's what we did here today. We don't have all the answers, and we didn't pretend to have all the answers, but we have been both writing notes down to where in our next education committee we can bring it up before both the department and our fellow colleagues in the House and the Senate Education Committee, because some of these things, I'm sure that they're already talking about. And so anyway, I appreciate you coming, and hopefully we'll get to do again this too.
And there's not much more I can add to that except thank you for being here. Thank you for letting us hear your voice. It's so important, and we want to make sure that we're hearing from the classroom and the issues, the concerns, and the ideas. We want to be able to take back your questions and your concerns, but you're the ones that have the most innovative ideas about how to do what needs to be done in the classroom. And so I thank you for letting us know that. We will try to make sure that we get to all of these questions and at least get them all together so that we can talk to DESE and through the committee, and we'll be glad to do that. Again, hopefully we can do some more of these if you're interested in that, and we'll be glad to take your questions to the Capitol with us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate you both giving up your time, and thank you for all the teachers that signed in today to join us. Hopefully you found some of the information very enlightening, and you can go back to your districts and ask your Ready for Learning committee or utilize the hotline that is set up by the ADE ADH down in Little Rock. So feel free to reach out to your local representatives as well and ask some additional questions that we didn't get to ask. But we do appreciate your time, and thank you for tuning in today.
Thank y'all.
Yeah.
Have a good day.